All right. Well, I know that the town, this is certainly not the first conversation you've had about this. You've been um, pondering your direction as a community for quite some time now. But just to give you all a reminder of where we are, I believe I last met with this group back in March. And at that time, I was given the marching orders to go ahead and try to draft some zoning language. Of course, not knowing at that time, and we're still haven't nailed this down as to what geography this zoning might apply to. But the direction at the time was, let's assume it's going to be a zoning overlay district that you as a community will choose to apply somewhere in town and see what that might look like. Um, so I, having looked through your existing zoning, assumed that maybe a path of least resistance would be to use language that you already have adopted in your zoning bylaws. And you have a district now, a floating overlay district that would allow multifamily housing. So I basically took that and adopted it such that it would comply with the state's regulations for MBTA communities. So, for example, kept a lot of the same purpose and describing what an underlying what an overlay zoning district is and what applies in the underlying zoning. Talk about permitted uses, and so the nice thing about an overlay is we can say there's one permitted use here, and it's multifamily housing that complies with the state's MBTA Communities Act, and that's what would be allowed by right in this district. And if someone did not want to build something like that, then they could build according to the underlying zoning, which, depending on where you place this, would probably be single family homes, right? Like most of the community. So we used the dimensional and building requirements that you currently require for that multifamily overlay that you have today. So that means a minimum lot size of 20,000 square feet, minimum street frontage of 100 feet, that standard 2.5 stories or 35 feet in height, whichever is less, 25% maximum lot coverage, 40% minimum open space, and most importantly, setbacks 50 feet on all sides. And that includes a vegetated buffer. So we basically took all the same standards that you would currently apply if someone were to take advantage of that floating overlay zone that you have on the books today, including the landscaping requirements. As I mentioned, the 50-foot setback includes a buffer area, also specific parking and access requirements, lighting, and so forth. So, one of the things that we've gone back and forth on a lot with the town is the design. And one thing that we keep reiterating is that for this to be considered by right, you can have some basic design standards, but not design guidelines. So we have included the basic design standards that you have for your multifamily overlay today, but not design guidelines. We had to change the application process because, again, that has to be by right. I think your current overlay requires not only an official change of zoning, which means going to town meeting, but also a special permit. So, of course, that's one of the principles, the primary principles of the law is that this has to be allowed by right. Of course, you can still apply site plan review, in which case your staff, Jasmine, would be responsible for making sure that any development complies with your site plan standards. So that is it in a nutshell in terms of how I approach this. I wanted to make it as simple as possible, and again, thought that maybe the um, most, or the least controversial way to go about this would be to adopt language that you already have on the books to the greatest extent possible with dimensional standards that you have already said would be appropriate for any multifamily housing that is proposed. So, we can certainly talk about that. I know that the planning board has reviewed that language and commented on it. And the next big step really is determining where you would like for this to apply. We've been doing a lot of work on the compliance model, and this is the spreadsheet that the state has provided that allows communities to test a particular district and make sure that its parameters comply with the law. So we have tested a number of 40B sites throughout the town. We looked at some of the properties along Junction Street and tested those. And really, the outcomes of that compliance model will vary depending on the geography that you ultimately choose. So one of the things that I've been working with Jasmine on is testing, what happens if you bump the minimum lot size from 20,000 square feet to one acre. And for some geographies, that doesn't change anything. It's perfectly fine. For others, depending on their size and other conditions, it makes it so that that lot would not be in compliance. So it's hard to say a blanket, is 1 acre okay? We don't know until you've chosen a location and we tested. So that's one of the things, I would love to get out of our conversation today, if at all possible, is there a preferred location? Because that really, at the end of the day, is going to drive what you need to do to comply. But that's my overarching summary of where we are to date and some of the decisions that are still before you.
So has there been any approval of the 40B site as an MBTA overlay district? Has a precedent been set yet? I know the answer in the past was always submit it and we'll look at it on a case by case basis, but
I have not seen any approved districts based on strictly a 40B. That
okay.
said, a lot of the communities that have submitted to date are not the, adjacent small towns like Dover. And
Right.
it's primarily the adjacent small towns like Dover that are in a position where some of those 40Bs are, the only things that they're putting on a map. So it does not surprise me that we haven't seen that yet, because it's really that last round of communities where that would even be on the table. And I know you have not wanted to be the guinea pig.
Right.
And,
Right.
Jeff, Jasmine and I met with our town council. We do so every month. And last month when we met her, we were talking about MBTA. And of course, she personally is handling other towns that are small adjacent communities as well. And of course, she's got her colleagues in the law firm that are handling others.
Sure.
And she mentioned that that she is very concerned, and I can't remember the town that she specifically mentioned, but that it appeared that EOHLC is currently saying that a town cannot apply its regulations. So looking at MBTA almost the way they look at 40Bs. Have you heard anything about that?
Can you restate the question? I'm not sure I follow.
The EOHLC is currently saying that a town cannot apply its town regulations to prevent MBTA housing.
again, I'd need more context to.
I think maybe a little more context would be that if we were, that they're suggesting, and Nina told us that she disagrees with this reading of section 3A, and that she imagines if they try to implement it, it would be, there would be a lawsuit. But essentially that in the same way that 40B applications can circumvent our local town regulations like septic and water, for example, or other, that MBTA would have a similar muscle behind it. Have you
That's
heard
not my, no,
that?
that is not my understanding, and I
Yeah,
have
us
not
either.
heard that. I have not heard that from anywhere.
Okay.
From the get-go, they've always said, look, the whole point of this is that your zoning still applies, that this is not like 40B, and that if, you know, I mean, look, the state is definitely getting tired of communities locating these things where they know they can't possibly be built, even if they meet the letter of the law. And I
Right.
think therefore they're getting cranky when that's what they see. But I don't see anything in the law that would suggest that your zoning could not be applied. Again, I think they may not be thrilled with what you're doing, but I agree. I don't think there's a legal leg to say you can't do this.
Particularly in light of, sewer and water and more rural towns, which
Exactly.
is more of the small adjacent towns. So it really hasn't come to a head. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
and I think
a
particularly when it
long-term
comes to
issue.
the infrastructure, they
Yeah.
were very explicit in
Yeah,
both the
exactly.
law and the guidelines that you can make a zoning district today where you do not have adequate capacity, and you could deny an application because you don't have adequate capacity with the thought that someday in the future you will build that capacity. I mean, that they were always like, those were among the talking points when this
Exactly.
all started. So unless they're evolving in their interpretation, that's been the direction we've been getting.
Yeah, I understood that to be the case too. And so when it was raised, we were like, whoa, what is that? So we're glad to hear. And Nina was going to do a little more investigating, but
Okay.
she's our, so that's kind of interesting.
And for us, infrastructure is a huge problem. I mean, it just doesn't exist in town.
Right.
So no matter where we designate this overlay area, there's always going to be the question of, do we have the infrastructure to put in this number of units?
Right. And I think, from the state, when the state starts evaluating these adjacent small towns, and I've been working with other communities that are similar. If you put your district somewhere that is like, there is absolutely no way in the next 50 or 100 years that anything could ever be built there,
they'll deny it.
That's gonna raise a red flag. If you look at some of the areas that we've been considering as a community, there are still legitimate obstacles today, but there is a possibility that in the future you could figure out the technology and make it work. They're gonna have to accept those places because there's nowhere in the community that doesn't have
Right.
certain obstacles.
Right.
So as long as you can say with a straight face, this could happen here someday, if not today, that should be okay.
So
it has to be
Janet
okay.
has a question. She's patiently raised her hand.
Yeah, actually, I have two questions. The first is related to the site selection process. I think like a town like Needham and Wellesley that actually have MBTA service, I think there's some criteria in terms of site selection. Like
Yes.
to be as close as possible, walking distance. So we don't have that scenario. Are there any criteria in terms of site selection that we have to follow? Or could we pick, say, 5 different sites throughout town?
So the only stipulations for you have no size minimum and you have no location requirement. Anything that is basically you could have something as small as you wanted, so long as it fit your unit capacity at least 15 units per acre, whatever that looks like. Now, that could mean you did a tiny little spot where you're allowing 7-story buildings, you know, so you have to spread that out to a point where you're comfortable with the density within that area. So in that respect, the only stipulation is whatever density level you're comfortable with, up to no less than 15 units per acre. If you are designating an area of less than 5 acres, then the entire thing has to be contiguous. If you are designating more than 5 acres, then you can split it up. So you do have some flexibility there.
Great. And then just to follow up a question, and I know we want to keep this as simple as possible to get it through town meeting, but I'm just curious, Dover is, we're talking about forming a sustainability committee. And part of that would be trying to encourage net zero housing or more sustainable housing and design features. I'm wondering if you've seen other towns sort of go a little bit above and beyond with the design standards than what's actually required. I'm just curious.
You have to be careful with putting additional design standards on your MBTA community district that does not apply elsewhere. So if you were to say a blanket, we are now adopting this building code that applies to all new construction in the town, then you have a good shot of that. The state's going to say that's okay. If you say we're only going to apply that to new multifamily development within the MBTA communities, that's not going to fly. So certainly, if the town wants to start exploring sustainability standards that they're broadly applicable, that's fine. But I wouldn't try to use MBTA communities as the test case for it, because that probably would be frowned on.
Great. Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
Yeah, Janet, Nina's made it very clear to us that we can't do anything that's more restrictive than any other of the zoning areas of Dover. So, Jeff, one question. 1 acre, 15 units minimum per acre. If we allow 20,000 square feet, so let's say half an acre, do we prorate that so that has to have a minimum of 7.5 units, or round up to 8? How does that work?
That's a marvelous question. I don't know that I can answer that off the top of my head. I'm gonna look into that. Because I know the state has been shifting its, or let's say refining, and I think it's fair to say refining its interpretation of that density standard. For example, they are now saying, with the exception of adjacent small towns, that they are possibly going to prohibit communities from putting a district-wide cap on density for a variety of reasons. I think, again, you as a small town adjacent are probably fine with that if it comes to that. But they are concerned that if there are multiple parcels and one has a lot of wetlands in it or unbuildable land, and another has more buildable land, and the lot that has more buildable land is constructed last and the district has already reached its cap, then that's not distributing the zoning regulations equally among parcels, and so they're starting to frown on that. So I think the state is evolving how it determines that whether or not you've met your 15 units per acre. But at the end of the day, all that really matters is the compliance model. So if you put in your parameters into the compliance model, and the state has already determined what the unbuildable areas are and where the sensitive lands are, So that's just dealt with on the state's map. And in a lot of ways, that's an advantage for you. So you don't have to, like, once you've got your zoning in place, you don't have to worry about, well, how do we calculate now that it's 15 units per acre? All that matters is if the stipulations of your zoning have gone through that compliance model and the state has said, okay, this meets it. Now, once you're actually enforcing that zoning, as long as you're just enforcing what's written, it doesn't, the compliance model results no longer matter. I know that's a rather convoluted way of answering your question, but I think the point is you can calculate that however you want, so long as the zoning that you adopt pans out in the compliance model.
Is a compliance model something that we can use, or does it require somebody with your expertise?
Good
You
question.
can absolutely use it. I've shared a copy with Jasmine, and one thing that I've offered, and we've offered this to other communities that we've been helping, is we will do a educational session, and we can teach Jasmine how to populate that. The most and there's all the state has, I mean, it's 50 pages long, but they have very extensive instructions for how to use the model that anyone can use and learn. The most complicated piece is in the GIS, where once you've selected the geography that you want, using GIS to pull the parcel information and enter that into the compliance model. But that's by far the most complicated thing. And otherwise, once you're actually got that in there and you're playing around with it, it's not complex at all. And we'd be happy to give you that skill set, so that, you know, once our contract runs out, you can continue to do that yourself.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Jeff, just a quick question. If I heard you right, the compliance model, which is probably based on Mass GIS information, has identified undevelopable areas that if you tried to create that as a site, that would be rejected. Is that right?
Yeah, so it has areas that they're calling excluded. And they're excluded for primarily environmental reasons. Some are excluded if they're publicly owned properties that are unlikely to ever be developed as housing. So that's automatically, so if you enter a district and includes excluded lands, the compliance model is going to take that out automatically. So again, once you're actually reviewing a development, you do that the way you normally would for any other development, with you don't have to take any extra considerations. But the state will determine your compliance based on the land that they've already excluded. There are communities I've worked with who are sort of an opposite situation from you, where they've said, actually, there's excluded land here that we don't think should be excluded. We want to be able to use it. We want to be able to build on it, and here's why. And so there's a process for requesting that certain excluded lands be included as developable.
So do we know so I'm assuming we know what the excluded land is in Dover? So where is that? Carol, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's basically all the all the land with CRs, conservation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have that on various maps, assessors built, you know, and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah. So Jeff, one of the things that we've been talking about is over the next 30 days during the rest of your contract, is to the kind of deliverable we would like to have by the end of the month. And I know you've been doing a lot of work with Jasmine. We might have a couple more pieces of information for input today, depending how the next couple of minutes of conversation goes. But the thought was that we would ask that you give us I'll call it a final draft, if you will, of a bylaw.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that because we're a small adjacent community and because there hasn't been enough examples and state activity with small communities, and we have until December 31 of 2025, that we would basically put it aside and wait for the, the activity this fall with 100+ communities finishing up by the end
Yeah.
of this year. And obviously there'll be some that are starting in first quarter of 2025, towns like us. And that certainly town council and Jasmine and her colleagues as town planners, to just be a lot of more talk and experience as to what to do with towns like ours. And then we can take that kind of experience and fine tune the bylaw to meet the needs.
Sure.
Sound like a realistic plan for you?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine for me. And I would add to that list, we can schedule a time to train Jasmine up on the
Yep.
compliance model.
Great idea too.
Absolutely. Just to the whole task force, the issue of the overlay district, we've talked about the fact that in our sense, it's probably a more difficult, certainly a more politically difficult issue at town meeting than probably the bylaw terms itself.
Right.
A couple of experiences have just come up that sort of to Robin's point about working with friendly developers. So we had the Pulte property. Jeff has looked at that from a compliance model standpoint, because a developer identified property that could be developed for multifamily housing. In that case, it's probably going to be 40B, but nevertheless. Today, I walked 93 Dedham Street, which is a 4-acre lot with a house and a garage, which looks like an apartment above it. Totally wooded, backs up on to the cemetery and to the back of Dover Farms. One abutter way up in the back left corner, 3 abutters on Burnham Street Road, and that's it. And the whole lot is incredibly wooded. And it was like, gee, that would be a great place for some multifamily housing. And guess what? A developer has bought it. In this case, Pat Corrigan. And between Pulte and 93 Dedham, it just dawned on me that it's really the developers who know the property in Dover that is viable for multifamily housing. And I've got to call into the realtor who's working with Pat just to see what the latest is. Jason told me the other day that they had requested a soil testing done at 93 for multifamily housing. So it's out there. But that we need to find a way to get some of that kind of expertise when we start trying to identify property. And maybe we don't need to do it right now. Maybe we can wait until the winter time to start the process. But it's going to require some expertise that we certainly, and knowledge of that we don't have at the planning board level. Then you add into it some of the stuff that you'll see if you take a look at the Zoom meeting from yesterday relative to infrastructure and nitrogen and all that kind of stuff. So the issue of where the overlay district is becomes a little bit more complicated. But it ties back to something that Jody and I were talking about earlier today. And that is, right now, we debated at our last task force meeting, the bylaw clause A2, which says the purpose is to preserve the rural character of the town while also encouraging an alternative pattern of development. And the conversation we had was, are we encouraging or are we permitting?
And
that-
my comment here is, I think at town meeting, you use the word encouraging, and this is going down in smoke. So you have to, this is for compliance, and we have to do it. So allowing is probably, even though you may be indirectly encouraging, but allowing it on this particular site.
I totally agree, but it has all kinds of implications sort of throughout the bylaw and as we start looking at overlay districts. So I would like to, if possible today, just get a consensus that in the bylaw, we're talking about allowing an alternative pattern, not encouraging. Does everybody, whoever agrees with that, raise their hand? Okay, so I think we'll go with allowing at this point. So thank you.
So Carol, I'd like to go back to what we were talking about before, to 93 Dedham. So, right now, I believe, I don't know if it's official, has Pulte signed the PNS? Have they walked away from that deal?
You mean
Yeah.
on Junction Street, Robin?
Yeah, on Junction, right.
Walter, you're there too. I haven't heard a word since news came out that the Medfield Selectmen refused to allow connection for either water or sewage. Walter, have you heard anything?
No, I haven't heard anything further on it.
So I guess where I'm headed with this is, in order to be compliant, we need to designate an MBTA overlay district. But in the meantime, I think we talked about designating some of the 40B communities already, but we need an alternative because that may be turned down. That's going to make us compliant. So the question, so right now, there seems to be a potentially active multifamily site at 93 Dedham. So the question is, are we hurting ourselves by not approaching the developer and being proactive and saying, do you want to consider an MBTA overlay district here?
Well,
Go ahead, Jody.
it's a really interesting question because I think it gets back to the philosophy of this. Because if our it sounds kind of like a horrible thing to say, but if the primary goal of this effort is to pass a zoning bylaw at town meeting that complies with the MBTA Communities Act in order that we preserve funding opportunities for the town of Dover, then it may or may not be in our best interest to be in partnership with a developer on this project from the get-go. If we want to actually get something built, that's a different conversation.
Right. So I'm just torn because the bottom line is, at some point, you have to be compliant.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, you're just designating an area and you don't have to build anything. But
Well, you're saying at some point, like in the next 50 years, or are you saying
today compliance means designate an overlay district
yes,
and you're done,
you're
right?
done?
And if a developer comes up, you work things out with them. And that's your only requirement.
Right.
But I could see that being
Change.
just step one.
That's
And
what
then
people
the
are afraid of,
question
right?
is, are we going to, and I don't know, because I don't have a crystal ball.
Right.
Will we be kicking ourselves that we never did anything at 93 Dedham Street?
Well, a
Or
couple,
at least tried. And I realized, and this was the same issue we had with Pulte. It's just so early in the process, you don't really understand what these things need to look like. You may be agreeing to something that you didn't necessarily have to agree to. Regardless of whether or not Mass Housing or the Commonwealth wants to, once, I don't want to say the word I'm looking for, wants to take into consideration, but we have infrastructure problems. I mean, we have no delivery system for water or sewer, which you need in these multifamily developments.
but to
And
Jody's,
we're gonna need to solve that, and maybe 10 years from now, there'll be new technology and it will be a no-brainer. But right now, today, we have nothing.
but to Jody's point, we need to do, we could make the case that we do whatever this simplest way to get to yes at town meeting.
Right.
Nothing is cast in concrete. If 2 or 3 years from now, after we have this wonderful housing consultant do this great housing report, and we look at it as part of the master plan, and the selectmen and the planning board and whoever else goes, wow, we're ready to really do something about multifamily housing that's not 40B. We can always go to town meeting, having identified maybe with a developer some property and said, we'd like to add an overlay district. There's nothing that prevents us from having 25 acres of overlay district versus the 7 that we need now.
No, I get all that. I'm just,
I know.
you know, and I agree with you if what we're just saying is to be compliant, this is what we need to do. We've identified this portion of land. This is the bylaw. You can check the box over, you're in compliance.
I mean, I don't think we want to get to a point like Milton and probably a couple of other towns. where
Right.
After town meeting, and in our case, $14-15 million of identified
Right.
is at risk.
I think the really underlying issue here is also the infrastructure, because, you know, I haven't been able to get through all of it, but I have listened to almost half of the Zoom that Carol sent around that was really looking specifically at septic and drinking water. And for example, something I learned, private wastewater treatment facilities for, you know, a developers believe the project size needs to be about 300 to 400 bedrooms to absorb the cost of a private wastewater treatment facility. And for drinking water, for projects with more than 8 units, on-site wells are considered a public water supply with all the contingent sort of rules, regulations, and costs associated. So like those are such foundational hurdles from a development perspective that it feels to me that we are going to get really stuck and possibly not be able to get a bylaw passed.
No, I agree. So,
Yeah. As much
so
as I
then
agree with you, Robin, because I really actually do, and I can see the creative possibility of it entirely.
So Janet has her hands up, and but I just want to say one thing before I turn it over to Janet. You know, then from this conversation, I think our priority has to be to be compliant with the MBTA Communities Act and to draft a bylaw that we can or believe we can get passed at town meeting. So those are the 2 boxes we have to check right now.
Yep.
And those are our priorities. And, you know, in the meantime, this committee will be working with a housing consultant, will be more forward-looking, and we'll be thinking about different options that may or may not be suitable for an MBTA overlay district.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I think Carol's right that almost as politically challenging as the actual bylaw and what it says is the selection of the site.
Right.
Which is going to be a really interesting process over the next 10 or 12
And that's why the 40Bs are the path of least resistance, because they already resist.
Exactly.
There's no fear of change, but unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice. We also need to have in our back pocket another area.
Right. It's just it's weird because I think it's very hard to communicate, and that's why the education piece of this is going to be really critical. But like, if we could be really smart and thoughtful about an MBTA overlay district and a partnership with a development, to your point, that is providing an option for developers in Dover, which might make them less likely to choose 40B, which gets everybody upset. But it's a very big like educational process to get people there.
Right. Go ahead, Janet.
So I would think that no matter what sites are selected, that it would be crucial that we have outreach to those property owners and to minimize any pushback at town meeting, to make sure they're on board. And it wouldn't be seen as encouraging them or working with them. But I think that it could be so controversial to both abutters and a potential property owner if we didn't do that outreach. And I'm just curious if Jeff has some knowledge of how other towns have gone about communicating with potential sites and how to minimize controversy.
I mean, like you said, you minimize the controversy by being open and having those conversations early. You know, if I've worked in communities where the press leaked that someone was interested in a particular property and the property owners have been informed yet, and all of a sudden, town halls getting these angry calls, and you definitely you don't want that to be what drives the conversation, right? So, yeah, as soon as you have thoughts for particular areas, reach out to the property owners, have those conversations. I mean, we were surprised. I was working in another community, another small community, where there were some property owners who stepped up when they heard about this and said, "I want my property to be."
That's what I think too, Jeff. I think that's highly, like, not a totally crazy idea
Yeah.
that.
It absolutely happened, and people were like lobbying to get their properties included within the district.
Yep, it can increase the property value.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Options of who you can sell to.
Right.
Okay, well, we've already taken up 45 minutes on MBTA. I know that's not always the intent and it tends to be subsuming. So if there aren't any more questions, Jeff, we look forward to you working with Jasmine and finishing up the draft bylaw. If you would let us know about the proration of acreage relative to the density, that would be helpful.
Yep.
Jeff, I just wanted to mention, you had sent us a density map that you thought was a useful kind of visualization of density for without getting too stuck in design. And I noticed on there that they show some visualizations of prorated density. Just FYI, like there was I think it was, yeah, one of the examples was maybe a half an acre or something. Anyway, just wanted to mention that to you as you're researching.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that there are some simple examples out there.
Right. Any other questions for Jeff? Jeff, thank you so very much. This has been.
Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome, and best of luck to you all. We'll do our best to set you up to be in as good a position as possible before the end of the month.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Take care.
Okay, so then the next item on the agenda was the MBT, the bylaw. So do you want to go through each of the open items, Carol? And I think the biggest issue was encouraging versus allowing, and we got that answer, so that's good. All right, and then the next item was the timeline. Do you want to quickly go over that? I could share.
That'd be great. So
I think I can share. Let me.
So Jasmine put together this timeline using some stuff that she and Jody had done as well as a fresh look by Jasmine. For those that have had a chance to look at it, it clearly is not particularly granular. And there's a lot of TBDs because clearly the what we end up getting from a housing consultant is going to play very much to our timeline. So we know the end date, that's December 31, 2025. We have an RFP that's going out, I believe, this week or next. The RFP has a requirement in it that the consultant help us with the MBTA process, and much involved with communication, education, and input from the community. So all those types of things play to, items 10 through 15 or 16. So you'll see a lot of TBDs into late fall and then the first half of next year, because I don't think there's any point, quite frankly, without getting input from our consultant to get more granular. But for those that have comments on it, we'll certainly take them in.
Yeah, I mean, my only comment was that we may need a second town meeting.
Yep. That's why we've met September.
Right, so I don't know if we want to put that on there, I hope that our outreach and education will help, but I don't know. I'm extremely concerned that the bylaw is not gonna pass the first time round.
Yep, it's sort of like the conversations we've had with Mark Maloney about the rail trail and then wanting to do maybe a special town meeting in the fall of 2025. And it's how many special town meetings are we going to need to have in the fall of 2025? Jasmine, if you want to add in special town meeting, potential second town meeting.
December 1st, whatever the first December is in
Oh, Lord.
2025.
A holiday special. I love
Yeah.
it.
Eggnog will be available.
Yeah.
We're gonna bring in Santa. We're giving everybody who shows up a present.
Right, there you go, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, all these concerns are so real, and it really reinforces, like, to the extent that we can keep this as simple and basic as possible, even though that will be frustrating. Oof, we'll be glad. We'll be glad.
This may push Felicia into retirement.
Well, in that case, we'll have to make sure we get it passed once.
Right, right.
Okay, that's all we have on the MBTA.
Actually, hi. Hey, may I just ask a couple questions because I am behind the curve here, but just trying to get an overall view. We have this area needs to accommodate at least 10% of our housing units. I mean, that is the number
No,
we
no,
need to
no,
have in this zone? No,
George,
it's not.
you know that conversation we had last week? You and I need to take that walk. We'll take
Okay,
a long walk.
okay, yeah.
You're
Yeah,
talking,
I'm just looking at what's on the Massachusetts site.
yeah.
Uh,
Let's
and- but
walk.
that's fine. No, we'll do that. No, I need to get caught up. That's
I
all.
know. That's yeah. Let's do it on a nice fall day.
Okay.
You know, one of, and this leads to the consultant RFP. So we did tweak the RFP and it did go out, but there were a lot of conversations as to whether the initial draft was too MBTA centric or not, and whether that would involve two different kinds of consultants. But I think at the end of the day, we got to the right spot. But one of the things Carol and I talked a lot about when I was trying to make sure I wasn't being overly sensitive to the wording was it's really up to us to identify other parcels of land. So we know that we may want to consider different types of development on. And Carol had mentioned that maybe we include Concom, or is it open space that has that listing? And we go through that listing, and it also goes to somebody's point here, it may have been Jeff's point or your point, Carol, that before designating an overlay district, we really need to talk to the property owners.
So the Open Space Committee keeps a list of large parcels of land. And I have a copy of it as well. I've spoken with Amy about it, and we're going to discuss it at next Tuesday's Open Space Committee meeting on how we might go about getting a better understanding about specific parcels. And they're members of the Open Space Committee that have been in the town for decades and decades and been involved with trails and open space and so forth, and probably have a tremendous amount of insight into a lot of these properties, many of whom are owned by folks that have been around for a long time as well, as to appetite for and probability of selling or whatever. So we'll start that process with open space. And, to your point, Robin, hopefully get a couple of potentials to talk to from
Right.
that. Yeah.
And then Mike, I don't know if you and or Jasmine just want to give an update on, I believe the RFP went out and we're gonna reach out to some consultants that we know do good work, just to let them know it's out there, right?
Yep, so the RFP has not officially gone out, so the comments were due by Friday last week. The deadline for the central registry is Thursday, so it's gonna be in this Thursday central register, so that it'll be live. It'll also be in next week's Hometown Weekly for the newspaper requirement. And then, yeah, to your point, and I spoke briefly about this, Carol, yesterday with Carol earlier today. I think we're not the only community that has an unfortunate experience with RFPs and not getting good responses. So one of the things we're going to try to do is direct send it to consultants that do this work. So obviously we all know Judy, and I can't say this officially, but we really hope it's her, right? But there are other people that do that, and so we are going to try to direct send it to them, which is allowed. It's just to say, hey, this is live now. Here's a copy. If you're interested, we'd love for you to respond. So the hope is by doing that, we will not end up with a big zero in our response rate. So.
Jasmine and I had discussed last week of having Jasmine go after her colleagues through their town planner listserv, which has served in the past, to see if anybody has any suggestions and names.
That's great.
Just touch base with
Janet, I don't know, maybe you have some suggestions that you may be worthwhile us reaching out to and letting them know that this proposal is out there?
Yes, I'll think about that. Yep.
Yeah, if anybody has any suggestions, just if you could send them directly to me, that would be terrific.
So one thing I noticed in the RFP that we had an aggressive 7-day turnaround to make a decision.
So based on your comment, we actually changed that to 14 days, just to give us a little breather. But still, to your point, what I can do is maybe Labor Day is Monday, so maybe next week we could send out a poll for a one-off meeting just to review the RFPs, so we can get that on the calendar. So thank you for, even though I appreciate your comment, we extended a little bit. Your point still is valid, even 14 days.
Okay, great, thank you.
Right, and because I was procrastinating and having a really hard time with the scope of work, I spent an enormous amount of time rewriting the background information that came out really well in the end. So that was my contribution. Because I was agonizing, I kept, every time I started to address the scope of work, I got myself all bent out of shape. So one good thing came out of my obsessiveness. Then, our next item of business is really this housing task force. And, certainly we all agree that the RFP triggers the next phase. And as part of the next phase, we really need to expand the members of this task force. And we need to identify critical skill sets that we would like and try and recruit those individuals. One of the things we really wanted to try is to find a potential Dover-friendly developer that might be able to educate us a little bit on what makes a property or a development financially attractive. What kinds of margins are they looking for? Because I think we need to understand that to understand what potential designs could look like. And then we also really need somebody, and this is just my opinion, so please jump in, somebody who can help us with the communication aspect of it. And in addition to that, we need to make sure that we get all demographics in the town. So somehow we need to get to school-age parents. We need to get to the seniors, which I think is a little easier. There's this whole group of empty nesters like my generation, that even though we are seniors, we don't consider ourselves seniors. So you know, so there's, and those are the people that are first to say, I don't know anything that's going on in town. And it's, so, you know, how do we get them to recognize or to start paying attention? So I would love to put together a list. If people could just send a list, and maybe we could actively recruit people. You know, we could even put together a marketing brochure with, you know, the background, why this will be such a phenomenal experience for somebody to
Do we
get
know-
involved in the town.
Robin, do you have a sense for how big you'd like this committee to be?
Not too big.
So are we
So I
looking
was thinking like,
for people, 7 or 8? Do you have a
yeah,
sense?
yeah.
And while folks are thinking about that, please keep in mind that the planning board is also looking for a new associate planning board member. Since Valen, our associate member, is now a full member, and we'd love to find an attorney as well.
So, you know, we do have a table at Dover Days, and there will be a recruiting, the Board of Selectmen, there will be a recruiting feature. I told Mike we should think of gifts to give people to get them to the table.
Unblended scotch, 1 bottle. Thank you very much.
You're already a volunteer, we don't need you.
I never got
But, you know, it's really important to get people involved. I mean, Walter, maybe you can think of, you know, some developers that have come in that we may want to reach out to.
local developers.
Local developers, you know, that have experience with multifamily, because I think that is really important.
Yep. Well, that's going to be the challenge, because I think, as I mentioned last time, Robin and I had come up with somebody who would be perfect in so many different reasons, checking off so many boxes that Robin talked about, and she just doesn't have the bandwidth.
Right. And unfortunately, that's what we're gonna find, and this is such a critical committee to what Dover looks like in 2020. Well, we're already in 2020, you know, 2030, 2040. It's what are we gonna look like 20 years from now? Because we're gonna look different. We are different today to what we looked like 20 years ago, so.
Yep.
And
Well,
then,
let me put some feelers out there. Let me talk to a few of the developers that, and let's see what kind of reaction we get. I think it, as we talked about earlier, how do you determine what makes it a viable project for them, and what makes them want to take it on? And those are very difficult things to answer right now. But I think, if nothing else, let's find out if we have developers that would be interested in partnering in and exploring what we might be able to do.
I think we have to be careful about finding people to talk to, the friendly developer concept that Robin's got, versus those on the housing task force, because then it becomes self-serving to those folks. So I think
Right.
there'd be a little balance there as well.
Well, that's the other thing that we need to be careful of too.
So Robin, you had asked me to reach out to John Sullivan to see if he could be a resource. And I haven't heard back from him, but we have a meeting tonight. I'll ask him again.
okay.
But was it just to provide feedback or to take on a more formal role?
To be honest, I don't remember.
Okay. I'm sure he'd be glad to give us some feedback. I'm not sure about if he'd have the time to take on a formal role, but I'll run that by him.
Right. And you know, and that's the thing. It may be that we have to get people with special skill sets just to serve on the committee when we need them. So,
Jody?
bye Jody, thanks.
Yeah.
And then the last item of business really is, I want to really thank Anna for all the hard work she did. I believe we have a final version of the sustainability charter or mission. I will look at it one last time, Anna, but I think it looks fine. And the goal here is to present this to the Board of Selectmen in September to get sign off from selectmen and then to establish the committee, and it will no longer fall under this umbrella. So thank you very, very much, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the help. Thanks everyone for the input. I have to run in like a minute, but I would love any last feedback or input. I'm trying to set something up that lets us advise the selectmen, advise other boards, help promote transparency, dig into questions of whether what we want to be doing with sustainability is what we're actually doing, stuff like that. And then, be a resource and educate folks. So the goal is to write a charter that does that and sets up a structure that lets us do that. But if we have to change it, that's not the worst thing in the world, but I'd rather get it right the first time because it sounds hard. So more input would be great.
Right.
I would just have one comment. I would
Yes.
maybe considering expanding it from just 7 individuals. Like the Open Space Committee, I think having a larger group would allow, because this is going to be really a working committee. These are going to probably be worker bees, not just people who show up once a month. And there could be quite a bit of work outside of the meetings.
Mm.
If it was a larger number, then they could have little subcommittees and then report back to the committee. So that would just be my suggestion. And also, people are busy. So if you have 7, you have to have at least 4 for a quorum. And I don't know, that's just my
We see that. Makes sense. Thanks for the suggestion. Okay, were you gonna?
I mean, we could also see how the recruiting goes.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just so hard to find people
Well,
that want to volunteer.
I think this one, as we've talked about before, there's so many people that have expressed interest in this over the last 5 to 10 years that I would imagine it will be, may not be easy, but it will probably be easier than a lot of the other committees.
Yeah,
The only other-
the reason. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Anna, you go first.
Yeah, the reason I picked 7 was just to wrangle the issue of not having too many people at the meeting, because if we fully staff, we had all 7 people plus the non-voting members, we'd end up with a group of 10 or 11, which seemed like a lot to orchestrate. But it's a good point that if we are 1 member down, it's hard to hit quorum.
I had just one quick comment, and that is I was really happy that you specifically mentioned the schools because I think there's a big opportunity there. And I realized that in your first, I don't know if it's the first paragraph, but very early you didn't mention the schools. And I think that was just an oversight because in every paragraph after that you did. I don't have the document in front of me, so do you see what I mean?
Yeah, here's the link in the chat if anyone wants it. Yeah, I had, in the charter, I say selectmen and other town boards and committees. But
Yeah,
then you're right, once I get to structure, then I talk about school committee.
So I would recommend that you mention the schools specifically when you talk about the selectmen and boards and committees and schools, just so it's clear from the outset that they're included.
Sounds good. I will adjust that.
Yeah, Anna, you might want to speak with Val Lynn, who chairs our tree committee, because Angeline, who's been our student rep on the tree committee, is now off to college. So she has provided Val with some contact information to try to find
Oh,
somebody
yeah.
level. So maybe there are 2 or 3. So you might want to check with Val.
That sounds good. We'll do that.
Well, we could also go to guidance because there may be people that are really interested in studying, you know, environmental science or sustainability. And it would be great if we could get, you know, maybe a sophomore so they could stay with us for a couple of years. But, you know, there are a lot of really motivated young kids, and this is a great way to build your resume for college. So, especially if this is something you're passionate about.
Yeah.
All right, so that our next meeting is September 25th. Please send any agenda items you would like. Hopefully we will be making a decision or looking over proposals from consultants by then. You can smile, Mike. And have a great Labor Day weekend, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.